It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion. Today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Tuesday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, or if you're joining us on the YouTube channel, your first watch every day. Time for Herd Mentality. Always love doing this episode where you guys send in questions, comments, takes, whatever you have, and I respond to them here on the podcast. As a reminder, you can have your item addressed on an episode of Herd Mentality by sending me a DM on Twitter at the Joe Marino, or shoot me an email, joe@thedraftnetwork.com. Tons of great stuff to get into today. Let's get started. First one comes from Chase. Chase says, who would you identify as the top three underrated players on the Bills, and how do you see them outperforming expectations? It's a really good question. Three players that come to mind for me. First of all is Taron Johnson. And it's not so much that he's underrated, but maybe more underappreciated for what he does as the Bills slot corner, which is basically a starter for the Bills, somebody who's on the field nearly every single snap. How the Bills funnel a lot of throws towards Taron Johnson just kind of based on the leverage that they play with in coverage, and put a lot on him to make tackles, to fit the run, and to be sticky in coverage against slot receivers. I think he's a super important player that I think everyone understands is a good player, but maybe he's a bit underappreciated. The next player that I want to mention is wide receiver Jamison Crowder. I just don't think there's enough hype around Jamison Crowder as the Bills slot receiver. I talked about this last week on the podcast where I did my superlatives episode. And Jamison Crowder comes to the Bills a year younger than Cole Beasley when Cole Beasley came to the Bills, but with way more production. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's a copy-paste Cole Beasley for Jamison Crowder, but I think they can do a lot of similar things, and I think Crowder gives the Bills a little bit more down the field and a little bit more after the catch compared to what Cole Beasley gave the Bills offense. And so I just feel like there should be a lot of hype for this guy coming in and catching 70 to 85 passes and really being a chain mover and restoring what the Bills lost in Cole Beasley. And the last player that I want to mention is Tremaine Edmunds. And I'm not going to offer a whole lot of analysis on this. Listen to the podcast last week on Friday, and I think you should come away with an appreciation for what he's asked to do, and certainly recognize the inconsistency, but also the weight of the inconsistency and the context behind it. I think there's a lot of good conversations to be had. So I think he's another underappreciated player on this roster, just mostly because I recognize there's a lot of Tremaine Edmunds fans, but for there to be so many doubters and people that just don't like him and just take great exception with him being the linebacker or the middle linebacker for this team, I think is pretty unfounded. Next one comes from Chris, who says, I'm not sure where to find the proper statistics for this, but I'm curious for the quarterbacks with the top sack to pressure ratio. You can rank quarterbacks based on the number of sacks, but that ignores if those players see less pressures. Curious to see how Josh Allen ranks and who the other top guys are. So in terms of pressure being turned into sacks at the lowest frequency, right? Guys that are pressured but don't get sacked, right? That's what we're looking for. Josh Allen, last year, number one in the entire NFL. He was number one in the NFL in 2020 as well. Josh Allen is the best quarterback in the NFL at not allowing pressure to become a sack. Only 10.6% of the pressure that Josh Allen faced in 2021 turned into a sack. The second lowest was Jalen Hurts at 13.2%. And third was Patrick Mahomes at 13.5%. So Josh Allen, the best for 2 consecutive years at not allowing pressure to turn into sacks. And it shows up, right? Like every number, every statistic tells a story. You guys watch Josh Allen play football. You see him stiff-arming guys in the pocket, making people miss, guys falling off of him because they can't get him down, and then Josh Allen hitting a big-time throw. I've seen it so many times. So you can see that number and understand that he's number one and by a good clip, but also as you think about the why and the story behind the number, Josh Allen's that dude in the pocket. Next one comes from Skip, who says, who will be Josh Allen's most utilized deep threat this season? This is a really good question. It feels like a basic question, but this prompted some research on my behalf, and I learned a lot by researching this, and it's going to help me kind of have a better perspective of the Bills' passing offense and how the different pieces this year can be used. And so when I go back to last year, I went through and I took Josh Allen's most frequent players that he targeted, basically everyone that had 70 or more targets last year. And then I went through and I looked up their charts, their receiving depth charts, where they're catching the football, where they're targeted. And I was able to figure out which players Josh Allen targeted the most. And this will give us some clues this year. And so when we talk about deep targets, I'm referring to 20-plus yards down the field in terms of air yards, right? You're 20 yards or more beyond the line of scrimmage when you're targeted. So Josh Allen had 87 such throws in 2021 where he targeted a receiver 20 yards or more down the field. And so of those 87 targets, 31 of them went to Stephon Diggs. And so those 31 targets, 20-plus yards down the field, represented 19% of Diggs' total targets, but 36% of Josh Allen's deep targets, and that's clearly the most by a good clip. The most frequent player that Josh Allen targeted down the field in 2021 was Stephon Diggs, 36%. 31 of his 87 targets down the field were to Stephon Diggs. And so I think that will continue to be true. Cole Beasley had 2 targets, 20-plus yards down the field. That's 2% of his total targets and also 2% of Josh Allen's total deep targets. And so this is where we reintroduce Jamison Crowder to today's podcast and understand that Jamison Crowder gives the Bills a little bit more in terms of a down-the-field presence than Cole Beasley. And so now you have this really dynamic slot receiver that can run good routes and separate and uncover quickly, and you trust him on those choice routes to get open and pick the right leverage and read the right leverage, but also a guy that can use that vertical push in his route stem to get down the field and present another vertical option for Josh Allen at a much higher clip than 2%, right? So you're doing more with that slot player. I'm excited about that. Dawson Knox had 12 targets. 12 of the 87 targets that Josh Allen had, 20-plus down the field, went to Dawson Knox, which was 15% of Dawson Knox's total targets and 14% of Josh Allen's deep targets. I think this is a number that can come up a little bit. I think he can push for maybe 17, 18%. You can see more down the field usage for Dawson Knox. Gabriel Davis, 19 of Josh Allen's 87 targets down the field went to Gabriel Davis, which represented 26% of his total targets and 22% of Josh Allen's total deep targets. Now, this is interesting to me. And this is what we've talked about with Gabriel Davis as not being a top 2 option for the passing game, but being kind of the 4th, 5th guy in the pecking order for targets. And he was able to take advantage of it. Like, there's no question he was a beneficiary to his role in the offense, right? That helped him produce. And so that 26% of his total targets, I would expect to come down, right? Gabriel Davis is going to have to win in more ways for him to be a good number 2 receiver for the Bills. And I think he can do it, but it's something for us to acknowledge and recognize. Then lastly, Emmanuel Sanders, 18 targets, 20-plus yards down the field, which was 25% of his total targets and 21% of Josh Allen's deep targets. So what does this all tell us, right? The Bills don't have a one-trick pony. They don't have a guy that's just the burner, the down-the-field threat that they dial up the deep ball to, which is a good thing. You want to be able to throw the ball deep to a variety of players, and the Bills clearly have that. clearly have that in players that they like to push the ball down to. And you have returning players in Diggs, in Knox, and Davis. And now, obviously, some of those deep targets are going to go to other players like a Jamison Crowder, like the Isaiah McKenzie, Tavon Austin, Marquez Stevenson combination player. So I don't think you're going to see any one guy command the majority of the deep targets. I think you're just looking at an offense that pushes the ball down the field to a lot of different players. Awesome question, Skip. Really like what we were able to unpack because you asked that question and I researched it and I thought we got some good information out here because of it. Justin has another good one here. I like this question. Justin says, if Trent McDuffie was on the board at pick 25, right, in the 2022 NFL draft, do you still think Brandon Beane would have drafted Kaiir Elam? And who do you think will be the better pro? So this is, I can't answer this for sure, right? But I can offer an answer that's rooted in good process, and that's all I ever really try to do. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, I'm right, but I try to have good process to back up what I say. But if you guys remember, and I'm sure this prompted Justin's question, Brandon Beane has admitted that when Kansas City traded up to get Trent McDuffie, that it prompted them to trade up for Kaiir Elam because he was the last remaining first-round grade that they had. And I think Brandon Beane was being honest when he said that. I do. And so with that in mind, if they were both there at 25, would he have picked McDuffie or Kaiir Elam? Well, let's look at Brandon Beane's tendencies when drafting cornerbacks. And that's Trey White in the first round, Taron Johnson in the fourth, Saron Neal in the fifth, Rashad Wildgoose in the sixth, and Dane Jackson in the seventh. If you guys remember, we did the Brandon Beane Draft Tendencies podcast back in April. And this is something that I uncovered there. What the common denominators between the 5 corners that Brandon Beane has actually drafted, all 5 of them have arm length of greater than 30 3/8 inches. They're all above 187 pounds, and they're all above 5'11". They're all, again, I'm going to say this because it's going to be important. It's going to allow us to answer the question. All of the cornerbacks that Brandon Beane has drafted as general manager of the Bills have over 30 3/8 inch arms, over 187 pounds, and they're over 5'11". Kaiir Elam checks all of those boxes. Trent McDuffie only checks one of them. They both check the weight box. But Trent McDuffie is 5'10 3/4, 29 3/4 inch arms. So he comes below the height and the length thresholds. Kaiir Elam 6'1 1/2, obviously above the height threshold, 30 7/8 inch arms above the length threshold. And I think that you could really love the makeup of both of these players in terms of how they're wired, their pedigree, guys that love football. But Kaiir Elam's the one that checks the size thresholds. And for that reason, I believe that if they were both on the board, Kaiir Elam would have been the pick. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports information. You can find everything over there. Football's futures, Major League Baseball. They've got golf, soccer, all the fights. Anything you want to bet on, you can find over at BetOnline. It's really fun to take advantage of some of the esports and the live betting. They have Vegas casino games. Check them out. Super easy to use website that you can use on your desktop or mobile device. It is the best place for all your sports wagering information and sports news. It's BetOnline, and it's where the game starts. Let's move on to the next one here, which comes from Matt. Matt says, if the trade with Washington actually went through, who would you have chosen in James Cook's spot? Also, do you see Zach Moss making the team and outsnapping Johnson? Do you see the James Cook hype as a little overblown? So I think what Matt's referring to is the Bills being able to sign J.D. McKissic, the Washington Commanders running back that agreed to terms with the Bills and then wound up not signing the contract and sticking with Washington. And so if the Bills had J.D. McKissic, they probably don't prioritize James Cook, and the draft looks different. So if I were to guess here, I would think based on the Bills picking a linebacker in the third round, and then they went punter and then wide receiver, I would think that they were prioritizing linebacker and wide receiver. Now, I wouldn't rule out an offensive lineman, because right in that range of offensive line were a couple of targets, right in the range where they picked James Cook were a couple of offensive line targets that I think would have made a lot of sense. Guys like Dylan Parham from Memphis, Josh Ezeudu from North Carolina, Ed Ingram from LSU. I think the Bills very realistically could have picked one of those guys in the second round. If they were to go for a wide receiver, a couple that would have made sense, Jalen Tolbert, Avalis Jones Jr., those guys went kind of in that range as well. They would have made sense to me. Now, I don't think they would have picked a linebacker, and let me tell you why. I think the linebacker they wanted was Terrell Bernard. And you've heard Sean McDermott reference the endorsement that Baylor head coach Dave Aranda gave to him regarding Terrell Bernard, and talked about how tight they were. And you could tell that McDermott really values Dave Aranda as a coach and how he deals with players. And so I think the Bills always wanted Terrell Bernard in the third round. But had they had J.D. McKissic, I think you would have seen one of those offensive linemen I mentioned or one of those wide receivers. Ken says, about Josh Allen, I was wondering if you thought having so many options with all the new players would be bad, or do you think he will be fine? I'm just a little worried. It's a good, fair question, but this is something that I had a criticism towards Josh Allen earlier in his career. And those of you that listened to the podcast in 2019 and 2020 will maybe remember me talking about this, where I just didn't feel like Josh Allen very consistently got on the same page with multiple weapons. I don't think he did a good enough job of getting everyone involved in the passing game. I don't have that concern anymore. And I think going back to the first segment of this podcast, just talking about the distribution of deep balls, it speaks to that evolution. And we've seen Josh Allen very quickly be able to get on the same page with new targets. Look at John Brown and Cole Beasley. Career years, the first year that they were with Josh Allen. Look at Stephon Diggs, the same thing. So I really don't have that concern about him being able to get on the same page with multiple weapons, even new weapons, and distribute the football effectively. I think he's proven that over the last couple of years to be something that is well within his wheelhouse. So I understand the question, but based on the information I gave, I really don't share in any concerns. Justin with a different type of question for us. He says, you got any advice about marriage? I'm getting married this weekend to the woman of my dreams. Also, is it too soon to buy a Kaiir Elam jersey? I just got a good feeling about this kid. Thank you, and go Bills. Well, first of all, Justin, congrats on your wedding and getting married. And it sounds like you found an awesome partner there for you. Now, I've only been married a little over 3 years, so I don't have all the answers as it relates to marriage, but I would recommend take out the trash before you're asked to do it. That's a good piece of advice. But if I had 3 legitimate things that I would offer to you that I think are important, I would say communicate all the time and remember that you are on the same team. You guys are for each other. Nothing is a competition. You guys are on the same team. Communicate. Make sure everybody knows how everybody feels and work through stuff. Number 2 is identify your partner's love languages and prioritize them. Really, really do that. Figure out what their love language is and respond accordingly. And number 3, choose your partner. This should have been number 1. Choose your partner every day and value the commitment that you made to them. Not every day is going to be, peaches and cream or whatever, easy things, but just remember the commitment that you made and choose them every single day. And when you make that commitment to choose them every single day, as you make decisions throughout the course of your day, you're going to have that foundation and that principle in place that they are the priority. And so when you're trying to figure out how to spend your time, you have free time or you have an opportunity to do something, remember that you chose your partner and do something that would be truly aligned. Make sure that your actions line up with what you say your priorities are. So if you choose your partner every day and you say, this is the number 1 priority in my life, make sure that the way that you behave is consistent and that there's congruency between what you say is important and how you act. That's the advice I would give you. As far as the Kaiir Elam jersey, I'm going to tell you what. I went on a stretch of buying jerseys for the Bills' first-round picks, and I've got a closet full of like C.J. Spiller, Marshawn Lynch, Marcel Darius. I'm out. I'm out on buying jerseys, to be completely honest with you. I haven't bought. The last one I purchased, I think, was Marcel Darius. And they're expensive. And if I'm going to buy a jersey, it's going to be a classic player. Somebody that's not going to let me down. Somebody sent me a Bruce Smith jersey. So I have a Bruce Smith jersey now, but get a vintage player. Get Josh Allen. That's a safe one. Get a Stephon Diggs. I would be cautious, and that's not a knock on Kaiir Elam. It's just kind of my own personal thoughts on jersey purchases. Next one comes from Crass. Crass says, I know this pod is called Locked On Bills, not Locked On New Jersey, but I was hoping you might give a quick summary of your thoughts on the offseason for the Giants. I'm curious to know if there is anything we might learn about McBeane from the early returns on their coaching and front office tree. Granted, it's just one data point, but is there anything from the Giants offseason that makes you go, that's classic McBeane? I've always wondered how much we might be attributing preferences to McDermott and Beane that could instead be the influence of their staff. Having Dable and Shane both end up in New Jersey might give us a window into finding that out. Love the question, Crass. So this is challenging because you asked this question and my mind started spinning and I'm starting to think, okay, how am I going to answer this? How do I feel? And I think that there are some dynamics this year from the Giants that really didn't give us a full opportunity to find those parallels. I mean, they didn't enter a situation where they had any cap space. For the most part, you saw the Giants have to let players walk in free agency and even had to cut some good players like a James Bradbury. So that didn't give them the flexibility or spending power for us to really see those vintage McBeane moves. The second thing that I would say is, do you remember who Brandon Beane came up under? Dave Gettleman. And Dave Gettleman's a joke as a general manager. And so just because Brandon Beane came up under Dave Gettleman, you don't see Dave Gettleman in the way that Brandon Beane runs the football operation. So, you know what I mean? Like, there's not necessarily always going to be those parallels. I don't think I've once watched Brandon Beane run this team and say, oh, there's the Dave Gettleman in him. Not at all. But then when I do look at the draft, the Giants, they had the 2 top 10 picks. They had a bunch of draft capital. I'm kind of surprised on what they did. I think they got a couple of good players in the top 10 in Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal. And I'm not surprised that they took an offensive tackle and a defensive lineman, right? That's definitely prioritizing the trenches, but they needed to. Those were like, even if you didn't prioritize the trenches, which I don't think any team actually has that philosophy, the way that the Giants roster was constructed, they had to get an edge and they had to get an offensive lineman. So I'm not surprised by the positions, but I am somewhat surprised by the players. And I don't want you to read this the wrong way, but if the Bills under Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane were making the same selections, I don't think that Kayvon Thibodeau or Evan Neal would be options for the Bills just kind of based on what I know about them and how they're wired. They don't scream culture, Buffalo Bills process guys. Doesn't mean they're not going to be good players, but you just kind of have an understanding of some of the core principles that the team prioritizes and what you know about those players. And the Bills aren't going to ever pick a player that isn't aligned the right way and wired the right way and would fit into the culture. Again, not knocks on KT or Evan Neal. They're going to be good players. They're physically gifted. They deserve to be picked where they were. But I would be very surprised if those were players that the Bills under Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane would actually pick. They're not bad guys. Don't get me wrong. They're not bad guys. I'm aware of some information about them that would surprise me if they were Bills targets. So I thought that was a little bit strange. And then Wan'Dale Robinson, the wide receiver from Kentucky at pick 43, was crazy weird to me. Just this really, really tiny wide receiver with no length. Seemed like a major reach at 43, but I guess they wanted their Isaiah McKenzie player. And then Cordell Flott, just kind of a really undersized, unproven corner at 81, was really surprising to me. So I didn't see anything in this offseason that screamed McBeane to me, completely honest with you. We'll see how it evolves. We'll see what they do when they have more spending power. But the draft didn't look like a Brandon Beane draft at all. And, we couldn't learn too much about what they were going to do in free agency because they didn't have any money. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questions like, is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? And wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and save money when using Rock Auto. Why would you choose to spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? They have everything you can need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Make sure you write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. They have amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need over at rockauto.com. We got a few more to get to today. Next one comes from Suburban Driving, who says, why is Jake Kumerow never mentioned as an outside wide receiver option? All I heard last training camp is how he was lighting it up. Look, I don't want to, please don't think I'm being sarcastic here. But I think when you just be honest about Jake Kumerow being 30 years old, having been in the NFL since 2015, and having 8 catches for his career, despite spending time with Tom Brady in 2017, spending time, a good amount of time with Aaron Rodgers, spent time with Drew Brees in 2020, obviously Josh Allen, and realize that his career since 2015 has 8 catches to show for it, you can understand that there's a reason for this. And I think Jake Kumerow brings something to this team. He brings a lot on special teams. He's a good blocker. He gives size. But he's not going to be a priority to get on the field on passing downs. So I think that's just, to be honest with you, he just hasn't really proven anything in his career. And training camp practices, they're not NFL games. We hear all the time about receivers doing well in camp, right? Could be Isaiah Hodgins, Duke Williams, Jake Kumerow. Doesn't always translate to regular season. Eli says, if the Bills can't get to the quarterback with the addition of Von Miller, do you see a problem here? If you do, would it be a coaching problem? We have high expectations for Groot, Von, Epinesa, Boogie, and all the pass rushers. If we can affect the pocket in most plays, but pressure in the pocket is great. But if that doesn't translate to more sacks, are we in trouble? I love sacks and would love our D-line to be top 3 in sacks this season. I love sacks too. I really do. I love pressure on the quarterback. I like heating them up. I like making those guys uncomfortable. But as for your question, basically being if the Bills don't have tons of sacks this year, is there a coaching problem? I would say there's too significant of a sample size from Sean McDermott and Leslie Frazier coaching elite NFL defenses and getting good pressure and getting sacks for me to assume there's any type of coaching problem. I mean, the Bills had one of the highest sack percentages in the NFL last year. I can't get myself to buy into this. Too big of a sample size. Now I have high expectations too. I want to see these guys get after the quarterback. I want to see a lot of sacks. But I think we have to understand what number are you looking for here? What number would be so low that you start to question if these guys can coach? Because I've seen a pretty big sample size that proves these guys can coach very, very effectively. Last one today comes from Alex, who says, in the next herd mentality, could you take a moment to talk about Brandon Beane and how well he knows this team, knows what his weak spots are, and how he addresses those needs? The Bills have been to the AFC Championship game and the divisional game the last 2 seasons, and this year's teams looks like it could be the best of the bunch. I continue to be very, very impressed with Brandon Beane, and I think he has a very astute awareness to his team, the strengths and the weaknesses. I think he's very honest about the weaknesses, and he's very deliberate about fixing them. Now, has he always proven to get it right in how he fixes them? No. But more times than not, he does. My belief in him is very, very high. And my favorite thing that I've been saying about Brandon Beane on this podcast has been, despite everybody panicking that last year's team was the best team that the Bills will ever put around Josh Allen. Ever. This year's team is better. On paper, this team is better. And the Bills were over the cap entering free agency. They picked late in every round of the draft, and Brandon Beane found a way to put a better team together this year than he ever has. And so the way he has evolved and grown this roster to being among the best in the league for like multiple years in a row now, and widely accepted as the best roster in football right now, I think that says everything you need to know about the quality of the general manager that the Bills have in Brandon Beane. And not only does he collect really talented players, but he collects very talented players that fit together and maintain the culture that Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane have worked extremely hard to create in Buffalo. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. The next couple days, we're going to talk about trade candidates. It's going to be really fun, so don't miss it. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.